What we try and do is we provide models and information on the decision points that we think are important from a partnership standpoint. Things like, on an ongoing basis, how are we going to value shares and what are the implications of our valuation methodology? What should even be included in that valuation methodology? Things like, how do we support new shareholders entering into the practice? Is that, and into the real estate, should I say, is that something that we provide some sort of internal financing for, or is that something that they should go out and finance externally? And in both cases, what would that look like as the investment evolves from inception? And then exactly the same questions asked on the buyout side. If we're looking to create a structure where we're buying out physician owners at retirement, what are the manageable variables in there that will improve the outcomes to the group and make this a sustainable plan?
In this week's episode of the Providers, Properties, and Performance podcast, I interview James Winchester, Principal and Lead Financial Strategist at CMAC Partners. CMAC exclusively works with physicians that want to own the real estate where they practice. CMAC began with sourcing financing for physician-owned real estate. Now, in addition to financing services, they also develop ownership structures that allow clinicians to own different ownership amounts in different sites, and allows for ownership structures to change throughout the life cycle of a clinician's career. I'm glad to have met James, and I hope you enjoy the interview. James, welcome to the Providers, Properties, and Performance podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tricia.
So as I said, I'm really glad I found CMAC Partners. Why don't you tell me a little bit of the background of your company and how you guys got started?
Sure. So we work in the space of assisting independent physician groups with their real estate financing transactions. We started approximately 20 years ago, and we operated a little differently back then. We actually were working with a pretty unique product where we would go out and get variable rate demand bonds and went to banks and were able to get them backed by letters of credits from banks. And in doing so, we're able to get physician groups some, superior options in terms of their financing that they were getting from commercial lenders. 2007, 2008 hit, and CMAC as an organization really had to pivot. Actually, our name CMAC comes from Capital Market Access Company, which was originated because of the activities that we were doing in the bond market. But what we realized working with independent physician groups was that they were an extremely sought after asset class for banks to be involved with. Banks enjoy having relationships with those kind of groups. And when the bonds that we were securing for these groups became illiquid, those banks came back to us and said, hey, we're really liking the types of groups that you're bringing to us. We will be super competitive if you continue with those kind of groups and offer better than market commercial real estate financing rates. So that was the transition that we made, and continued offering that kind of support to independent physicians. We're now in a situation where we've got over 300 clients that we've worked with over those 17 years. Which we are very grateful for. And we found, interestingly, that independent physician groups, as they own their real estate, they often have different issues than other types of real estate owners. And that has allowed us to create some solutions around how physician groups can own sustainably their real estate assets, and make something that is fair and equitable for all, and not end up in situations where there's discord between the real estate and the practice, which we've seen over the years can be a real turn off to groups in actually ever pulling the trigger and going and owning the properties that they operate out of. So that's the pathway that we have kind of gone down as an organization.
And you guys offer, correct me if I'm wrong, but do you offer separate solutions for ownership structures in the practice versus the real estate?
So we're concentrated on the real estate side. Everything that we do as an organization, though, even though we're real estate focused, is done in order to strengthen the practice. And what the way that we see it is, if we can create alignment between the objectives of the practice and the real estate entity, we can actually provide a superior investment to those physician owners, because we end up transitioning the investment from a pure real estate investment, where they're carrying the types of investment risks that are common in real estate, to more of an investment in the practice, a real estate investment in the practice, because ultimately their risk is defined by the practice's ability to continue to make its lease payments. So we really look at the investment slightly differently. If we can get groups to create good alignment between those practice and real estate objectives.
Well, so when I get involved, they typically do it backwards, where they find the property and then they try to figure out how to structure it within their partnership. So it seems to me that you guys provide, hey, this is the structure of the partnership based on the, business objectives of the company. And then once they agree on that, so that doesn't hold up the deal, then they go find the property. Is that sometimes how that happens?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think most physician groups don't treat their real estate investments, in the way that I just described how the real estate investment can be structured at inception. Most of the time, it will be, a practice is looking to expand its space, and a subset of physicians go out and decide, hey, this is a good investment opportunity. Let's own this building, and then over time they grow, they evolve, and another subset decides, well, I like a piece of what those other physicians got. Let's do our own deal somewhere else. And then suddenly a group then, merges with this group, and they have legacy real estate ownership. And suddenly everybody sits around in a boardroom at some point and says, well, what are we going to do with all of these components? We haven't had the ability to optimize our network. If we make decisions, we're going to disproportionately affect one subset of the physician group relative to the other. What should we do? We have experience over the years of navigating that situation, of aligning the ownership of the real estate with the practice, such that when you're making decisions that affect the real estate, they're also affecting the practice. So I would kind of agree with exactly what you said. Oftentimes, when groups get into a real estate investment, it isn't carried out with the foresight that this is something that could be directly related to improving the practice, but rather a separate investment. And that can often, because these are assets that groups hold on to for a long period of time, that might be fine at the time that the investment starts, but by the time new partners have come into the practice and some of the physicians have retired, it suddenly becomes something very difficult to navigate.
And you guys you've put together structures. I think I read this, and again, you have to correct me if I'm wrong, but you've put together structures where physicians, they can move through their career to retirement, plus you can add the new physicians that may join a practice that want to participate in the investment as well. You've put some structures together for that to happen.
Exactly right. So one of the things that we like to try and point out early to groups is that for these kind of properties, and of course, I'm sure this comes up all the time in everything that you do, Tricia, but in these kind of properties, the value is driven by the lease. Mm-hmm. And most of these buildings without a lease in place are worth a small fraction of what they are with a lease in place. And ultimately, for most groups that we work with, we see it important to align the individuals that are driving the value of that investment, those being the partners that are paying the rents, who are in the practice, who are practicing, and those that are receiving the benefits of the real estate ownership. So what does that mean? It means that most of the time we're looking to create a structure that allows for fluidity as the underlying practice evolves, the real estate ownership evolves with it. And that carries some challenges, because it generally is a situation where value is increasing over time through the repayment of debt, hopefully the appreciation of the building. So there are certain tools that we use and options that we provide to groups to say, well, have you thought about it this way? And is there a way that we can revitalize or reinvigorate the investment such that you can once again get those physicians into the real estate ownership that have perhaps been prohibited from that investment because the equity in the building has increased so drastically?
Well, and I get the calls sometimes too, where they need my help because the practice, they're for lack of it, but they're breaking up. That, like, some physicians want to go one way and some don't, and sometimes it has to do with some want to retire and some want to still practice pretty actively. But then they get stuck because they've got this piece of real estate that they own along with the practice, and they don't know how to divide one from the other. And they don't necessarily want somebody that's no longer in the practice to be owning the real estate.
Sure. And to us, most of the time, it goes back to the operating agreement. We've ended up, I think, learning a lot from our clients. And the reason that we found ourselves learning this kind of expertise and providing these solutions is because groups are often trying to solve these items when they're going out and sourcing financing. There's some kind of structural change that's occurring, and we've realized that actually some of the best times to address these issues are when you have access to capital and financing. I like to think that we're not a one size fits all group, and even though we don't work directly, for example, in assisting groups with selling their real estate, sometimes just like the scenario you mentioned, sometimes that can be the most practical method of the group being able to move forwards. And I think that we certainly try and provide that kind of advice to our clients when we think that it's necessary. But back to my original point, I think most of the time in these scenarios it's driven by the operating agreement. Most of the time when we get involved, especially with real estate investments that have started a number of years ago, the operating agreement can be antiquated and not provide anywhere near the kind of provisions that are needed for the group, and that can be an expensive fix to carry out retroactively.
Do you have attorneys on staff at your company, or do they come with attorneys that you work with to put these structures together?
Generally, groups come with attorneys. I think what we try and do is we provide models and information on the decision points that we think are important from a partnership standpoint. Things like, on an ongoing basis, how are we going to value shares and what are the implications of our valuation methodology? What should even be included in that valuation methodology? Things like, how do we support new shareholders entering into the practice? Is that, and into the real estate, should I say, is that something that we provide some sort of internal financing for, or is that something that they should go out and finance externally? And in both cases, what would that look like as the investment evolves from inception. And then exactly the same questions asked on the buyout side. If we're looking to create a structure where we're buying out physician owners at retirement, what are the manageable variables in there that will improve the outcomes to the group and make this a sustainable plan? So in answer to your question, I think that our role when groups are going through that process is to help to demonstrate what options are available, and then fuel the group in understanding, well, when they have their conversations with their attorneys, which sometimes we're involved with, they can go to them and say, this is what we want, this is our roadmap. Now let's work on the legalities of those particular decision points.
So how do physician groups find you? Because I mean, is it more referral based, or how does like a group get introduced to you usually for like a first time, not a repeat business?
Sure, I'd say mostly referral based. We've been long time members of a number of different conferences actually, and probably about 40% of our business is in orthopedics, and we've been a long time member of Ortho Forum, for example. And generally, when we get into a particular market, as you mentioned, from a referral standpoint, we like to think that our involvement often spreads like wildfire, and has afforded us opportunities with other different specialties, usually from a pioneering orthopedic group that we've worked with.
And where do you work geographically? Where's your focus?
We are nationwide. So we've actually, even though I'm located in sunny Winter Park, Florida, and that is really where the rest of our company is located, we've done 3 transactions in Anchorage, Alaska. So we really are coast to coast.
Well, that's fantastic. And let me ask you, what is the largest physician group, the number of members that you've worked with?
It's a good question. I would say probably the largest is a large independent orthopedic group, somewhere in the region of 300 physician providers, is probably around the largest. I would say we have been fortunate to work with a few different multi-specialty groups, which are pretty large as well. But I would say orthopedics probably still just beats them in terms of their overall size.
So do you have to go and put a presentation together for 300 physicians, or is there some senior members that kind of take the lead that you work with? I'm just trying to figure out how you work through this, because when you present, like when you're presenting to sell a building to a group of physicians, you usually start with all of them, and they all have to raise their hand and a vote, and then it sort of goes to a couple of the leaders of that are taking the charge that go forward. So I'm wondering how you get through that.
Sure. I think different groups have different structures, and I think as the group gets larger, usually weirdly the audience gets smaller. So we generally find, for those real large groups, you maybe have an executive committee that will be perhaps 2 or 3 physicians and maybe an exec that are really given the authority to make the decision ultimately for the group. So really what we're trying to do is create something that is palatable for as many of those physician owners as possible. We do end up in some scenarios where there's a couple of times where we've had real complicated deals where there are multiple different facilities, multiple different properties that are owned by subsets, and within those subsets the ownership is disparate between each of the members, which means we end up running some pretty complex models to understand, well, if we bring all of those together and put all of those groups into a holding company, what does everybody end up with? And that can be something very important to do collectively with a group, because everybody understandably wants to be treated fairly and equitably, and wants to make sure that the value that they've built over time is being appropriately allocated to this new investment vehicle that they're going into. So we have had some scenarios where we're presenting that kind of structure to 80, 90 physicians at once. I would say that, it can be a challenging transaction, and it means that we're not unused to being on the phone with physicians, pre and post clinic, and at the weekends, to talk through the specific outcomes that they're interested in, because they, as I mentioned, they want to make sure that they are being treated right through the whole process.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like, do you start to get physician? Do you feel that you guys provide a solution, and do you have the conversations with physicians where that almost relieves them from having to make such a choice, where they can see that they can invest in real estate and have the passive income and economic benefit, as well as continue to practice medicine and not have the hassle of having to own and operate and all the other stuff that comes along that that you have to do when you own a piece of real estate? You have to take care of it, you have to meet with vendors, you have to do property management.
So the question is, do we get physicians who through our involvement feel more comfort level associated with investing in the real estate from which they occupy out of?
But if they're able to have economic benefit of owning real estate, especially the real estate that they occupy, while practicing medicine, and be able to have basically both, do you feel like you guys provide those solutions where you can solve a lot of the hassle of where they can be real estate investors and practicing physicians at the same time?
Sure. I think that a lot of what we end up doing is educational for many physician groups. That at some point they may sit around a board table and say, hey, we've had enough of paying rent, we want to own the property from which we're operating out of, but don't really think about it much more than that in terms of the investment that they are getting themselves into. And it's usually dictated by a couple of physicians within a wider group. It's not necessarily something that everybody is on board with straight away. And we think it's really important that when groups get together and make that kind of decision, that the majority, not necessarily all, because sometimes it can be nigh on impossible to get everybody involved, but the majority of the physicians are on board with the investment. And because of that, we often put together an educational program to take those individual, everybody within the group through, well, what are you actually investing in here? And I kind of would go back to my first point, that I think that for owner occupied properties, where tenant and owner are really one and the same, the investment parameters, the risk profile is completely different to a pure real estate investment. And I think that we have seen over the years when we broaden the investment group and get more of the individual physicians to understand through that educational process, it has made them aware that they want to further that experience, because it generally is a positive experience. We know almost no groups that have invested in their real estate and then ended up in a state of bankruptcy. I mean, it occurs occasionally, but in comparison to the types of risks that individuals go into when they're investing in third-party pieces of property, it's usually not quite not quite the same level. And the other factor is you're usually the controller of your own destiny, being the tenant that's paying the rent, which is driving that real estate investment. So yeah, I would say we certainly do see this as an opportunity that physicians can earn, passive income alongside their ordinary income, well, which is terrific. And in doing so, we see it as a furthering of the furthering investment of the practice. Another interesting, part of this is for 99% of independent physician groups, they earn their income through a year and then they distribute all of it at the end of the year, which they should do if they are able to, and there's no financial covenants, because it allows them to pay the least amount of taxes on their income and those kind of things. But in doing that, from an entity standpoint, there's no wealth generation component. What real estate offers those independent physician groups is another ancillary revenue stream where there is wealth generation. And so often, unfortunately, we see that the physicians within a group who are very high earners don't necessarily make the best decisions with their income. Fortunately, real estate, being illiquid, can sometimes be one of those investment opportunities on the passive side that will be fruitful at the time of retirement, and will be something that can carry them home and drive wealth for them over the course of their career. So I think that there can be a lot of benefits associated with it if you're, as you mentioned, marrying up that passive and ordinary income stream.
Yeah, and so you primarily just work with the owner occupied real estate.
Correct. Okay. Exclusively, actually.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, this has been interesting. I think I'll be keeping your number pretty close at hand. I like them to solve these problems ahead of time, because doing them during the deal is often challenging. So we're going to move into the Q&A to get to know you a little bit.
Absolutely.
All right. So what was your first job?
My first job. So I was actually trained as an engineer. My undergrad was in mechanical engineering. So I worked for a year at General Motors. And I think I had a pretty tough task, actually, looking back on it, because I was working in the manufacturing line over in Europe, and working as a quality and reliability engineer. So we used to get all of this data about how some of GM's vehicles were failing on the road, and it would be our job to go into the line and try to implement changes to the process, such that those defects, such that those claims were not, they were patched up and they were not received in subsequent vehicles. And that was a challenging process, because it usually involved adding time to a line worker's job who wasn't particularly interested in doing that, and certainly not from a young gentleman carrying a clipboard explaining exactly what needed to be done, such that we were providing the best possible quality vehicles to our customers. So it was safe to say that experience put me off engineering, at least in that capacity. And then I ended up coming over to the States a couple of years later to do my MBA, and that's how I ended up stumbling upon CMAC.
Oh, very nice. What would you be doing for a living if you weren't doing what you are now?
I think that probably some kind of consulting line of work. I very much enjoy the educational aspect and providing analysis to the groups that we work with, and then bringing that analysis to their attention to create tangible solutions. I think that, whether it be in this industry or outside, that would be where I would imagine I would end up working, and what I imagine I would end up doing if I wasn't working in this area.
Very nice. Who are you reading or listening to right now for news, information, or inspiration?
Sure. So I probably most recently, I don't know if you've heard of this gentleman, but a guy by the name of Sam Harris. I listen to a lot of his podcasts, which are, a whole host of different topics that I kind of find interesting. I've just started reading a book called Tribes because of some of the things. It was actually recommended to me because some of the things that we have going on with our organization and some of the ways that we're trying to cultivate different groups within this niche that we work in. So have just embarked on reading that. So I'm kind of excited to see what it's like. But there are a couple of things that I've been looking at recently and pieces of information that I've been getting, which is probably pretty aside from this particular industry.
Personal stuff.
Absolutely.
What is one thing you do every day for healthy self-care?
So I actually played soccer the whole way through my youth, and I played a couple of years collegiately over in the US, which was part of the reason why I was fortunate enough to come over here. So I still like to get my cleats on every now and again, and that I see as a really good way for me to decompress. And I guess because of that as well, I've remained pretty active. So I'm one of those people that tries to get out and do some form of physical exercise, a number of different times a week. Otherwise, I drive my colleagues crazy. So that's probably my best self-care.
So my husband is Brazilian, and when we first met, he played soccer recreationally 6 days a week. It was crazy. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was good. I mean, that was his mental release. But I have to ask you, so what's your favorite soccer team?
I'm a Man United fan.
Okay.
Which is pretty bad, actually, because I'm like 2.5, 3 hours away from Manchester is where I live in London, which probably doesn't seem that far to you, but that's like half of the UK. So all of my friends kind of, as I've grown up, tease me and say that I'm what they describe as a glory hunter by not supporting a local team. What's
your local team? What would be?
I'm closest to a team called Tottenham Hotspur.
Okay.
And those that, in your audience that know Tottenham Hotspur will know exactly why I'm not a supporter of theirs.
Do you think leaders are born or trained?
I think my experience has been that leaders come in all shapes and sizes. So I don't necessarily think that it isn't something that can be cultivated over time. I think that my experience of leaders, I've found easiest, represented through the sports teams that I've played in, and then seeing how they've transferred into kind of working life. But I think, some people lead by example, some people lead by the motivation that they provide to others. And I think that resonates differently with different people. So in my experience, it's probably a little bit of both, but certainly not something that cannot be learned.
Yeah, constant training and learning, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, James, thank you for this interview and your time. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. Appreciate you having me on.